This week, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians took to the streets, and millions more stayed home in a general strike. Much of South America's biggest, most populous country was brought to a standstill, with airports, factories, schools, public services all shut down. If this story sounds familiar, it should, because last year, a different set of protests brought down a different government, that of former President Dilma Rousseff. But last year's demonstrations got wall-to-wall coverage in Brazil's privately owned news outlets, including Globo, which is as dominant a TV presence as you will find in any country. The subsequent impeachment of Rousseff paved the way for current President Michel Temer, whose austerity-based response to an economic recession led to the general strike. But this time around, Globo and others don't seem to find the protest story quite so compelling. Critics are suggesting that's because right-wing media outlets prefer Temer and his austerity program to Rousseff, her leftist predecessor Lula da Silva, and the social programs that they brought in. Another factor might be that Michel Temer's government has been using taxpayers' money to persuade the news media to support his conservative agenda. Thursday, April 27th, business as usual on the Brazilian airwaves. On the eve of a national strike that would paralyze much of the country, the next day's demonstrations, already planned and with the media notified, are treated as a non-story.
It wasn't only a lack of coverage prior to the strike, it was also the fact that they covered the strike as if it was just something that was organized by the unions. Only unionized workers stopped, and the workers that stopped was against their will.
Muitas pessoas que moram nas capitais não conseguiram chegar ao trabalho.
And on top of that, always associated with violence and rioting.
Os manifestantes começaram a jogar objetos na polícia militar.
So that's a constant frame in Brazilian media.
E teve uma cobertura de 20.
There was 24 hours coverage, but strikers and demonstrators were never interviewed. Our arguments for the general strike were never heard. The mainstream media clearly had an editorial tendency to discredit the strike.
Pequeno grupo de vândalos ateou pedras e também furou os pneus de ônibus de viagem.
Showing pictures of disorderly conduct without telling people the real reasons behind it.
Os motivos da greve.
That was last week, but rewind to last year, and another set of protests to which the media took a very different approach.
Dá tempinho na cobertura do esporte. Vamos falar das manifestações que acontecem pelo país.
Back then, the demonstrations and the story were driven by an anti-corruption investigation involving the energy sector that would lead to the downfall of Dilma Rousseff, and an ongoing fraud investigation against the president who preceded her, Lula da Silva. The anti-graft marches went on for a full year, providing an ongoing narrative. The general strike lasted just one day, but with teachers, doctors, nurses, and bus drivers among those taking part, it was the largest such strike in Brazil for decades, and was backed by protests in 26 states. The two stories are not the same, but nor are they as different as the contrasting coverage that they receive.
The gulf in coverage is vast. The protests calling for impeachment against the Dilma government had huge visibility, with Globo's helicopter capturing the protest from the air and covering it all day long. With protests against Michel Temer, this doesn't exist. When it came to the general strike,
Durante todo o dia, o jornalismo da Rede Globo cobriu a paralisação por todo o Brasil.
the word strike was avoided. They talk only about demonstrations, protests and vandalism.
Many channels and programs, they are able to produce a coverage of an event like, the strike, where you have clearly two sides to it, and only give voice to one side. That's amazing. The media in Brazil is an oligopoly. It's dominated by a few groups.
TV presenters, as well as journalists, are being co-opted to support the reforms. Silvia Santos, who is the biggest, perhaps the most popular TV presenter in the country, was summoned to meet with President Temer. They met, and on the next day, SBT, Santos's channel, started to broadcast messages like, "Did you know that if the reforms don't happen, you might not receive your salary?"
The media story in Brazil starts with Grupo Globo, the largest mass media company in Latin America. It owns 122 TV stations nationwide, TV networks, radio networks, major newspapers, and cable TV systems. Like Globo, Brazil's other major networks, SVT and Rede Record, are family-owned or controlled. Their proprietors tend to, politically, tilt to the right, which is reflected in the coverage their platforms provide.
There is a stigma against Rede Globo. I don't know why. It's a reaction to Globo's type of coverage. Globo has commercial interests and covers or doesn't cover events in a certain way, or gives more space to this or that. It is up to them to decide. They are commercially motivated, as they should be.
Globo has a clear tendency to take sides politically. We know that their main financiers, their main advertisers, are the big banks, the automobile companies. Multinational corporations, in tandem with the Temer government, are pushing for the weakening of the state, opening Brazil up to privatization, liberalizing markets and loosening regulations. So there are very powerful economic players influencing the narrative.
And the Temer government is making it in the media's economic interest to support its policies. While preaching austerity and the need for economic and social reforms, the government boosted what it spends on advertising by 65% immediately after Temer came to power. That's according to Brazil's leading financial newspaper, Estadão.
The Temer government is buying editorial support. It's not simply increasing advertising funds, no, it's exchanging advertising funds for editorial support. They are already thinking about 2018, about the next elections.
If it's proven, if there is a clear channeling of funds to the media to get more favorable coverage of these government proposals, I think it would be rather promiscuous. I think it would be wrong for the government to do this.
With multiple investigations into corruption, economic reforms affecting future pension checks, state spending on advertising, and where that money goes, the Brazilian political story is a complicated one. The story of the media reporting on it really isn't. Basically, it's what happens when news outlets that are supposed to reflect a multicultural, multifaceted society, such as Brazil's, are owned by and reflect the interests of one slice of that same society.
The mainstream media groups in Brazil are dominated by white men from rich families who pass it from father to son, and the bias reflected in their companies is towards that section of society. There is very little space for minorities, for the working class, for other narratives. It's always the elite speaking to the people with their own bias and worldview.
So if you want to give it a class reading, you can say that, you know, they really silence the voices of the poor, the ones that they are getting hit the most by the economic crisis. They don't have a voice. What is not being represented is exactly the organized part of Brazilian society that opposes Temer.
E a gente começa essa edição mostrando agora de manhã a greve geral.
Brazil's first general strike in more than 20 years has ended in violence.
No decorrer da manhã, vários pontos aí com interrupções.
Agora começou a confusão. Policiais de lado atirando bombas de efeito.
Class and race dictate how people view the government reform.